I want to show you something that exists in the physical world, a $5 bill. Printed in 1862. The paper has darkened with age, but it is intact. On the front, an engraving of the Statue of Freedom that would eventually top the Capitol dome. On the back, a solid field of green ink. That green ink is why people called it a greenback. This bill was printed by the United States government, not by a bank, not by a private institution, not by any entity that charged interest on its existence. The government of the United States printed it, declared it legal tender by act of Congress, and used it to pay soldiers, buy weapons, build railroads, and finance the largest war the country had ever fought. You can still find these bills today. Collectors sell them online. Hold one, and you are holding a piece of a financial experiment that lasted less than a decade, worked well enough to win a war, and was quietly dismantled before most Americans understood what it had demonstrated. This is the story of that experiment, of the crisis that created it, the system it replaced, the war it helped win, and the sequence of decisions that ended it while the men who depended on it were still alive to object. The number to hold is not 23 to 21. It is 450 million. That is approximately how many dollars the United States government printed between 1862 and 1865 without borrowing from a single bank. $450 million created by the government, yet spent directly into the economy, not loaned into existence at interest. For a few years, the United States ran a parallel financial system that did not require banks to intermediate between the government and the people. And then, through a sequence of legislative decisions whose timing is worth examining carefully, that system was ended. The greenback in the drawer is still there. The question of what it meant has never been fully answered. The crisis that made the experiment necessary to understand why the government printed its own money in 1862, you need to understand the specific financial catastrophe that preceded it. Because the greenback did not emerge from ideology. It emerged from desperation. A government facing bankruptcy in the middle of a war reached for the only tool it had left. April 1861. Fort Sumter has fallen. The Civil War has begun. The federal government's financial position is nearly catastrophic before the first major battle is fought. The United States Treasury in April of 1861 held approximately $2 million in cash. The national debt stood at $77 million, already high by the standards of peacetime. And the war that was just beginning would cost, by the time it ended, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion. Nobody in Washington knew that figure yet. But Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase understood within weeks of taking office that the arithmetic was impossible under any conventional financial arrangement. Chase was a former governor of Ohio, a founder of the Republican Party, and one of the most capable administrative minds in Lincoln's cabinet. He was also, in the spring of 1861, a man staring at a set of numbers that did not add up and had no obvious solution. The conventional approach to wartime finance was to borrow. The government would issue bonds, banks would buy them, and the proceeds would fund military operations. Chase went to the banks. In August of 1861, he arranged a loan of $50 million from a consortium of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia banks. The banks paid in gold. The government got operating funds, but the banks were nervous from the beginning. The war was going badly. The first Battle of Bull Run in July had been a disaster. Public confidence in Union military prospects was shaky. The banks continued to lend through the fall of 1861, but they made clear they could not sustain the pace. The war was consuming money faster than any conventional borrowing arrangement could supply it. Then came December. On December 28, 1861, the major banks of New York suspended specie payments. They stopped paying gold to the government in exchange for government securities. The mechanism that had been funding the war seized up, but Chase sent a message to Congress that historians have been quoting ever since. He told them that the Treasury was running out of money, that conventional borrowing had reached its limit, and that without a new approach, the government would be unable to meet its obligations. He estimated the Treasury needed $600 million over the coming year. He had no clear idea where it would come from. Lincoln described the situation to his Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs in words that were recorded and have survived. He said, "What shall I do? Chase has no money, and he says he can find no way to raise any. The bottom is out of the tub." The bottom was out of the tub in January of 1862. The Union Army had over 500,000 men under arms. They were eating, using ammunition, wearing out equipment, and waiting for pay. The government that had recruited them was on the edge of financial collapse. Into this situation came a proposal that the banks immediately recognized as a threat to everything they had built. The man with the idea. The full origin of the Greenback proposal involved several people and some genuinely disputed history about who deserves credit for what. But the essential idea was straightforward enough that multiple people arrived at it independently, which tells you something about how obvious it was once you were willing to consider it. If the government could not borrow enough gold-backed money to fund the war, it could declare its own paper currency to be legal tender, not convertible to gold on demand, not backed by any specific reserve, simply declared by act of Congress to be money. You must accept this in payment of debts. That is what legal tender means. The banks had been doing something functionally similar for years. All banknotes, the paper currency that circulated widely before the war, were issued by state-chartered banks and were theoretically convertible to gold or silver on demand. In practice, a banknote was worth what people believed it was worth, which depended heavily on confidence in the issuing bank. The government was proposing to do what banks had been doing, but without the bank in the middle. Congressman Elbridge Spaulding of New York, who sat on the House Ways and Means Committee, drafted the legislation. He called it a war measure, necessary and justified by military emergency. The bill would authorize the Treasury to issue $150 million in United States notes, legal tender for all debts public and private, bearing no interest, backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the federal government. The banking community's reaction was immediate and intense. Bankers from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia sent delegations to Washington to testify against the bill. They argued that irredeemable paper currency was inherently inflationary, that it would destroy confidence in government credit, that it would drive gold out of circulation entirely, that it had never worked in the history of any nation that had tried it. They had historical examples. The continental currency of the Revolutionary War which had inflated catastrophically, was their primary exhibit. The arguments were not entirely wrong. Every one of the risks the bankers identified was real. Irredeemable paper currency does create inflationary pressure. It does affect gold markets. The history of paper money without metallic backing had not, up to that point, been uniformly encouraging. But the bankers were also arguing from self-interest, and the men in Congress who had to decide understood this. If the government issued its own currency directly, it did not need to borrow from banks. The entire apparatus of banking profit derived from the government's need to borrow would be bypassed. Every dollar the government spent as a greenback was a dollar it did not pay interest on to a banking institution. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, one of the most powerful members of the House and a consistent thorn in the side of financial interests throughout his career, cut through the bankers' arguments with a directness that the congressional record preserves. He said the choice was between two systems. In one system, the government borrowed from banks, issued interest-bearing bonds, and paid bankers for the privilege of financing a war fought by the people's sons. In the other system, the government issued its own money directly, paid no interest to intermediaries, and the people's money served the people's war. Stevens wanted the second system. He wanted it on principle, not just because of the emergency. He believed the power to create money was a sovereign power that belonged to the government, not a privilege to be rented from private institutions. The Legal Tender Act passed on February 25, 1862. The first $150 million in United States notes were authorized. By the end of the war, 3 separate legal tender acts would authorize a total of approximately $450 million. They were printed on paper with green ink on the back. Greenbacks. What the Greenbacks did, the immediate effect of the Legal Tender Act, was exactly what its proponents had promised and its opponents had feared, depending on which part of the promise and the fear you chose to measure. The Army got paid. This is not a trivial statement. An Army that does not receive pay develops morale problems, desertion problems, and discipline problems in that order. By early 1862, the Union Army had not been paid in months. The Greenbacks went out immediately, and the pay problem was solved, or at least substantially reduced, almost overnight. Suppliers and contractors who had been extending credit to the government in the hope of eventual payment received their money. The economic machinery of the Northern war effort, which had been grinding to a halt for lack of lubricant, began moving again. J. Cook, a Philadelphia banker who would become the primary agent for selling government bonds to the public, it used the greenback system to do something that had never been done before in American finance. He organized a network of 2,500 agents across the country to sell government bonds directly to ordinary citizens. Small amounts, $50, $100. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, mechanics, investing in the war. By the end of the war, Cook had sold approximately $1.5 billion in government securities to the American public. Lincoln had said from the beginning that the American people would finance their own war. The greenback system made this possible in a way that exclusive reliance on major banking institutions could not have achieved. The bonds Cook sold were denominated in greenbacks, payable in greenbacks, accessible to people who had never dealt with major financial institutions. The Northern economy during the Civil War years was, by the standards of the era, remarkably robust. Industrial production expanded. The Transcontinental Railroad project continued. Agricultural output held. New factories opened to supply the military. The inflation that the bankers had predicted came, but it was not the catastrophic collapse they had described. By 1864, inflation had reached approximately 25% annually. This was significant. It was not the end of the financial world. The Confederate economy, by contrast, was destroying itself through its own much more severe inflation. Confederate currency, also irredeemable paper, had inflated to the point of near worthlessness by late in the war. Southern soldiers were sometimes paid in currency worth pennies on the dollar of its face value. The Confederacy's financial management was genuinely catastrophic. The Greenback was not a perfect instrument. Lincoln and Chase and the Congress that authorized it knew this. It was a war measure, a tool of necessity. The question of what to do with it after the war was a question they left for later. But the Greenback worked well enough to help win the war, and that fact, by itself, was a demonstration of something. The question of Salmon Chase. Before we go further, we need to spend some time with Salmon Chase because his role in this story is genuinely complicated, and his complication tells you something important. Chase was Secretary of the Treasury when the Greenbacks were created. He administered the system. His face was on the first $1 Greenback, a placement he apparently found gratifying. He made the system work as well as it worked. He also, simultaneously and throughout his tenure, expressed deep reservations about irredeemable paper currency. He was not philosophically comfortable with money that was not backed by gold or silver. He was a hard money man who had been pushed by circumstances into managing a soft money system. He made it work because he had to and because he was competent. He did not become a convert to the principle. This matters because Chase left the Treasury in 1864, was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then, in a case called Hepburn versus Griswold, decided in 1870, wrote the majority opinion declaring the Legal Tender Acts unconstitutional. The man who had administered the Greenback system as Treasury Secretary ruled 6 years later that the system he had administered was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court reversed itself the following year in Knox versus Lee when 2 new justices appointed by Grant joined the court and the majority shifted. The Greenbacks were constitutional after all. But the Chase episode tells you something about the depth of the philosophical conflict over what money is and who should create it. Chase was not a corrupt man. Oh, he was a principled man whose principles about money creation were in tension with the practical demands of a war he was trying to win. He resolved that tension differently in peacetime than he had in wartime, and the resolution he chose in peacetime was the one that aligned with the banking community's view of how the world should work. The document that changed the system while the war was still happening. February 25, 1863, exactly 1 year after the Legal Tender Act. The war is still going. Grant has not yet taken Vicksburg. Lee has not yet been stopped at Gettysburg. The outcome of the war is not settled. The Greenbacks are circulating, the army is being paid, the bond drives are proceeding. Congress passes the National Currency Act. The timing is the thing I want you to look at. Not what the law said, though what it said matters. The timing. The Greenback system was 1 year old. It was working. The crisis that had created it was still ongoing, and Congress was already building its replacement. The National Currency Act created the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and established the framework for a system of nationally chartered banks. The Federal Reserve's own historical archives describe the primary purpose of this legislation clearly. It was designed to create institutional buyers for federal government debt. National banks were required to purchase Treasury securities as a condition of receiving their charters. In exchange, they could issue national banknotes worth up to 90% of the bonds they had purchased. Read that structure carefully. A bank buys $100 of government bonds. The government gives the bank $90 of national banknotes to circulate as currency. The bank earns interest on the bonds. The currency in circulation is backed by government debt. Under the Greenback system, the government created money directly and spent it. Under the National Currency Act system, banks bought government debt and created money based on that debt. The government still got the financing it needed, but now there was a bank in the middle, earning interest on every dollar in circulation. The Greenback had cut out the bank. The National Currency Act put the bank back in, and this was not the end of the sequence. The tax that killed the competition, 1864. Congress imposes a 2% tax on state banknotes. The local currencies that communities had been using for years become slightly more expensive to sustain. 1865. The tax rises to 10%. This is not a coincidence of timing or a separate policy initiative unconnected to the National Currency Act. The 2% tax of 1864 and the 10% tax of 1865 are the enforcement mechanism that drives currency into the national banking system by making the alternatives prohibitively expensive. If you are familiar with the history from the 1863 story, this sequence will feel familiar. A new system is created with preferential treatment. A tax is imposed on the old system. The old system cannot compete. It disappears not because it failed, but because the playing field was titled by legislation. The state bank notes that had been the primary currency of local communities for decades were gone within a few years, not because they were inferior, because holding them became expensive and holding national banknotes was free. But the Greenbacks were different from state banknotes. The Greenbacks were federal. They had survived the legal tender acts. They were legal tender for all debts. They could not be taxed out of existence by the same mechanism used to eliminate state currencies. What happened to the Greenbacks required a different approach. What happened after Appomattox, April 9, 1865? Lee surrenders at Appomattox. The war is over. 5 days later, Lincoln is dead. The men who took over the management of post-war financial policy were, in the main, men who had always been uncomfortable with the Greenback system. Hugh McCulloch, who became Secretary of the Treasury under Andrew Johnson, was explicit about his views. He believed the Greenbacks needed to be contracted, reduced in volume, and eventually retired in favor of a currency backed by gold. He presented this as sound financial management. The critics called it a transfer of wealth from debtors to creditors. The Contraction Act of 1866 authorized McCulloch to retire greenbacks from circulation at a rate of up to $10 million per month. The total volume of United States notes, which had stood at approximately $450 million at the end of the war, began declining. The economic effects were immediate and severe in ways that affected particular segments of the population with particular precision. Our farmers in the Midwest and South had borrowed during the war years in inflated dollars. They had taken loans when money was relatively plentiful, when prices for agricultural goods were relatively high, when the inflationary wartime economy made debt manageable. Now they had to repay those loans in dollars that were becoming more valuable as the money supply contracted. The amount they owed in nominal terms stayed the same. The real burden of that debt increased with every greenback that was retired. This is the mechanism of deflation. Creditors, people who are owed money, benefit when the currency appreciates because they are repaid in dollars worth more than the dollars they lent. Debtors, people who owe money, are harmed by the same process for the same reason. The Contraction Act of 1866 was policy that benefited creditors and harmed debtors. The creditors were disproportionately the banks and financial institutions in the Northeast. The debtors were disproportionately farmers and small business owners throughout the rest of the country. Congress eventually stopped McCulloch's active contraction in 1868, responding to political pressure from the affected communities. But the damage was done, and the direction was set. The greenbacks would be reduced to a fixed amount and eventually made redeemable in gold, which accomplished the same purpose as retirement through a different mechanism. A greenback redeemable in gold is no longer a government-created currency. It is a claim on gold held by the Treasury, which is a very different thing. The people who fought back. The political response to greenback contraction was one of the most significant mass economic movements in 19th century American history, and it receives roughly one paragraph in most standard accounts of the period. The greenback movement began in the late 1860s as a coalition of farmers, labor organizers, and small business owners who argued that the post-war contraction was a deliberate policy designed to benefit financial elites at the expense of working people. They were not wrong about the effects. They argued that the solution was to maintain or expand a greenback currency, to refuse gold resumption, or to use the sovereign money-creating power of the federal government to serve the productive economy rather than the financial economy. The Greenback Labor Party, formed in 1874, ran candidates for Congress and won seats. In 1878, Greenback candidates received over 1 million votes in congressional elections, enough to elect 14 representatives. In 1880, the party's presidential candidate, James Weaver, received over 300,000 votes. These were not fringe numbers by the standards of the era. The movement eventually merged into the broader populist movement of the 1890s, which continued fighting many of the same battles. William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896, one of the most celebrated political speeches in American history, was in large part an argument made on behalf of the same people who had supported the greenbacks 30 years earlier, farmers, debtors, to people whose economic lives were being crushed by a contracting money supply controlled by financial institutions whose interests ran in the opposite direction. Bryan lost. The gold standard won. The Greenback experiment was over, but the movement it inspired tells you something important about what ordinary Americans understood at the time. They understood that the decision to contract the currency was a choice, not an inevitability. They understood that someone benefited from that choice and someone was harmed by it. They understood the connection between who controls the money supply and whose economic interests are served by how that control is exercised. They lost the political fight, but they were not wrong about the analysis. What the National Currency Act built to understand what replaced the Greenback system, you need to understand what the National Currency Act actually created and how it functioned. Under the pre-Greenback system, state-chartered banks issued their own notes backed by various forms of collateral. The system was chaotic, inconsistent, and prone to fraud, but it was also locally responsive and did not require the entire country's currency supply to flow through a centralized structure. Under the National Currency Act and its successor, the National Bank Act of 1864, nationally chartered banks could issue national bank notes, but only if they first purchased federal government bonds. The amount of currency in circulation was therefore tied not to the productive needs of the economy, but to the volume of government debt outstanding and the willingness of banks to purchase it. This created a structural relationship between the banking system and the federal government that was, from the government's perspective, useful. The government always had buyers for its debt. National banks had to buy bonds to operate. Demand for government securities was built into the legal structure of the banking system. But from the perspective of the broader economy, the structure had significant limitations. The money supply could not expand in response to productive activity. A farmer who wanted credit to plant could get it only if a bank in his community had sufficient bond-backed currency to lend. A community without a national bank had no access to the national currency system at all. The geographical distribution of national banking capital was extremely uneven. Bank capital concentrated in the Northeast, particularly in New York City, which became the reserve center for the entire system. Banks throughout the rest of the country held their reserves in New York banks. When agricultural communities needed credit in spring and fall, the demand hit New York, and New York's response determined whether the credit was available. This was the system that produced the agricultural credit crises of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. Not because individual bankers were uniquely villainous, but because the structure itself routed economic benefit toward the center and economic risk toward the periphery. The Greenback, whatever its limitations, had not required this structure. It had been spent into existence at the point of need, not lent into existence through a chain of institutions that took their cut at each link. The debate that Lincoln never got to have. Abraham Lincoln did not live to see the Contraction Act of 1866. He did not live to see the Greenback movement or the Populist Uprising or William Jennings Bryan or the gold standard's final victory. He was shot 5 days after Appomattox and died the following morning. What Lincoln thought about the long-term future of the Greenback system is something historians have debated and will continue to debate. So because Lincoln left no clear statement of his post-war financial vision. He was, throughout his presidency, focused on winning the war and on Reconstruction. The question of whether greenbacks should be permanent features of the American financial system or temporary war measures was a question he never publicly resolved. We know what he said when the crisis was acute. We know he supported the legal tender acts. We know he described the government's ability to finance the war through the Greenback system as one of the more remarkable features of the Northern War effort. His annual messages to Congress during the war years expressed consistent support for the system as it was working. We do not know what he would have said or done when the war was over and the banks wanted their system back. What we do know is that he was the last president while the Greenbacks were at their maximum circulation. Every president who followed presided over some portion of their reduction. The trajectory from his death to gold resumption in 1879 was continuous and in one direction. Some people have drawn conclusions from that timing that go further than the evidence supports. The connection between Lincoln's assassination and the interests of banking institutions is a claim that circulates widely and lacks the kind of primary source documentation that would be required to state it as fact. John Wilkes Booth's documented motivations were Confederate, pro-slavery, and personal. The financial dimensions of his act, if any existed, are not established in the historical record. What is established is the sequence: Lincoln alive, Greenbacks at maximum. Lincoln dead, Contraction begins. Whether that sequence reflects causation or coincidence is a question the evidence does not answer. I am showing you the sequence and asking you to sit with it. The thing that cannot be argued here is what cannot be argued, because it is established in the documentary record beyond reasonable dispute. The Greenback system worked, not perfectly, not without costs, but it worked. The United States government financed the largest war in its history, paid its soldiers, supplied its armies, and emerged victorious, using a currency it created itself without paying interest to banking institutions. The system was dismantled not because it failed, but after it succeeded. The replacement system, built while the war was still being fought, placed banks at the center of the money creation process and tied the currency supply to the volume of government debt that banks chose to hold. The people who were harmed by the contraction, the farmers and debtors and small business owners of the Greenback movement, understood what had happened. They organized politically and fought for decades to reverse it. They lost. The Federal Reserve System, created in 1913, built permanently into federal law the structural relationship between banking institutions and money creation that the National Currency Act had established in 1863. The principle that new money enters the economy primarily through bank lending, rather than through direct government spending, is the principle the Greenback system had temporarily suspended and the National Currency Act had restored. That principle has been the foundation of American monetary policy for over a century. It is not the only possible principle. The Greenback demonstrated that. For 3 years, the United States operated on a different principle. The war was won. The currency held together. And then the experiment was ended by people who had reasons to end it. The $5 bill with the Greenback still exists. What the desk tells me. I keep coming back to my grandfather's walnut writing desk, the one built in the 1850s with dovetail joints that still slide in perfect silence. I have thought about that desk many times while researching this story, because the desk was made in the decade before the Greenback and the decade before the guild system that produced it was dismantled by the same sequence of legislative decisions that eventually ended the Greenback experiment. The craftsman who made that desk operated in an economy where his reputation was his credit rating. His demonstrated skill was his collateral, and the community around him was his financial system. No bank stood between him and his livelihood. No interest payment was embedded in every transaction he conducted. The Greenback was not the same thing. It was not a return to the guild economy. It was a tool of industrial warfare, printed on a steam press and distributed through a modern logistical system to 500,000 soldiers spread across a continent. But it shared one structural feature with the guild economy. The bank was not in the middle. The guild craftsman did not need a bank to certify his credit. His neighbors knew his work. The Greenback user did not need a bank to certify his currency. The government had declared it legal tender. In both cases, a different intermediary stood in the place the bank would eventually occupy. In the guild economy, it was the community. In the Greenback economy, it was the government. Whether either of those alternatives is preferable to the bank is a question people have been arguing about for a century and a half. What is not a question is that both alternatives existed. Both worked in their contexts. Both were eliminated through specific legislative decisions at specific moments in time. The desk is still there. The Greenback is still there in collectors' hands. Both are physical evidence that the world we inherited was not inevitable. It was chosen by specific people at specific moments through processes that left documentary traces anyone can read. The questions that do not go away. On February 25, 1862, the United States Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. The government printed its own money, the war was financed, the Union was saved. On February 25, 1863, exactly 1 year later, Congress passed the National Currency Act. The banking system was rebuilt around government debt. The bank went back into the middle of the money creation process, 1 year apart, the same date. Whether that coincidence of timing was deliberate or accidental is something I cannot tell you. I can tell you it is the kind of coincidence that, once you notice it, does not leave you alone. The Greenback movement that followed Contraction was one of the largest economic protest movements in American history. Its central argument was simple. The power to create money is a public power. And when that power is exercised in the exclusive interest of financial institutions, the public that holds that power through its government has been robbed of something that belongs to it. The movement lost. But it was not arguing from ignorance. It was arguing from experience. The people who built the Greenback movement had used greenbacks. They had seen what a currency created by government rather than banks looked like and felt like in practice. They were not romanticizing an imagined alternative. They were defending something that had actually existed. I have only questions I cannot fully answer. Was the Greenback experiment a genuine alternative to bank-centered money creation, or a temporary expedient that could not have been sustained in peacetime? Was the contraction policy that followed the war sound financial management or deliberate redistribution toward creditors? Would Lincoln, had he lived, have fought to preserve the Greenback system or accepted its gradual retirement? I do not know. The $5 bill from 1862 does not answer these questions, but it asks them just by existing. The buildings the Carpenters Company built in Philadelphia are still standing after 2.5 centuries. The walnut desk built in the 1850s still slides in perfect silence. The Greenback, printed in 1862, still exists in the hands of people who understand that it is more than a collectible. It is evidence. Evidence that a government once printed its own money, spent it directly into an economy at war, and won 2 dates: February 25th, 1862, February 25th, 1863. 1 year. The system that cut out the banks and the system that put them back in. And the question that does not go away: if the first system worked well enough to win the war, what exactly was it that needed to be replaced? I have only questions I cannot fully answer, but the questions do not go away. And once you start asking them, you will find they never do.